Kibbutz is not just a community, it is a community of intention. And many people today are questioning our society's values and asking what gives meaning to life. An intentional community is a group of people who have chosen to live together with a common purpose, working cooperatively to create a lifestyle that reflects their shared core values. And actually, that is an outline which was proposed by an American member of the communal movement in America, of the Federation of Intentional Communities in the United States. Jeff Kuzeni, he unfortunately passed away a few years ago, to make the point that the concept of intentional community is not specific to kibbutz necessarily, but it is a concept which is very, very relevant. Not every community, you can have communities that are not intentional in any way, shape, or form. They're based on blood, they're based on geography, they're not necessarily intentional. But to say intentional is not enough, because there is a great big water divide, if you like, in terms of intentional community. There are intentional communities who are in it for themselves. They believe, if somebody believes what we want to do, let them join us, and our intention is to create a certain kind of way of life. But that's it. The other aspect, the other option is we're an intentional community, but the way of life that we are living, one of the aims, one of our intentions is to impact on society outside of us. So that's a crossroads, a crossroads decision. Now I must say that it's not totally black and white, and there are shades of gray, but in one short discussion today, we are going to present it in kind of a black and white way, because that is a very, very fundamental a decision that an intentional community, the people who are joining it, have to make. Now, the next question is indeed just for individuals, or is it part of a group of federations which then morph into movements, if we're talking about some kind of impact on society? Because, in general, one intentional community cannot really impact on society, except maybe in a very local sense. If it's really into trying to change society in a more macro sense of the word, you're talking about communities federating together in order to create a movement. Because what is a movement? A movement wants to move society from point A to point B, for better, worse, or indifferent. You have movements who are definitely for the worse, the Nazi movement, the totalitarian communist movement, and are movements who have a vision in a different direction. So in other words, what we're saying here is not even a value judgment. It's a kind of a description. The values are outside of it. The kibbutz movement definitely saw itself as impacting on society. To be exact, the kibbutz movement saw itself as creating intentional communities which, inside the way they function, would reflect in micro what would be desirable from their point of view to have in the society in macro. And in other words, the kibbutzim saw themselves also as I'm using the past tense deliberately, we'll get to that, as a political movement, or as part of a political movement. Because politics, as we learn from Aristotle, is the science of the affairs of man, because man is a social political animal, and so that is the context, the community context, for the purpose of this discussion of the kibbutz. But the kibbutz, the people who formed the kibbutzim were part of the Zionist movement. The Zionist movement is a Jewish national movement for self-fulfillment in its ancestral home. We're not going to go into today all the dynamics behind it, but the kibbutz, or as it was originally called, kibbutzah, which means a smaller group, was in fact a marriage of convenience between the establishment of the Zionist movement at the beginning of the previous century and a particular group of Zionist pioneers with a particular world outlook, which they didn't necessarily have to come together. There was a marriage broker by the name of Arthur Rupin, and in 1910 he brought about the first marriage, shall we say, of the Zionist establishment, which was a pretty small and weak establishment at that time, and these particular groups. Now, to understand the kibbutz movement, you have to understand where these people were coming from, what was their head, what was in their heads, and that is very important. What were the processes and events that shaped the mindset of these people at the beginning of the 20th century in terms of making a decision to band together to create a new kind of society? Well, number one, there was a breakdown of traditional Jewish society in Eastern Europe and Russia from, let's say, the end of the 19th century. There was the whole process of Western Enlightenment, which had started in the West in the 17th century. For example, most of you are from the United States of America. The United States of America is totally a product of post-traditional society, a society already born out of the values of the Enlightenment, which were crystallized at the 18th century level in the Declaration of Independence. But those ideas and ideals began to infiltrate the Jewish world only in the 19th century. So then we have, towards the end of that century, the emergence of a group, the Lovers of Zion, and in another direction, the founding of the World Zionist Organization, in order to be a political movement, in order to further the idea of a Jewish national movement, just as in those days there was the Italian national movement or even the German national movement. We're talking about Bismarck before Hitler, etc., etc. In other words, they were very much into the Bulgarian. A lot of the East European national movements had a lot of influence on these people, and this all happened at the end of the 19th century, when the people who were going to be the founders of the kibbutzim were just, in fact, being born and growing up. So the mindset of the pioneers meant a Zionist commitment, renewal of the Jewish people in its historical home. Renewal means Hebrew land, Hebrew labor, Hebrew language, and social justice. Social justice, from their point of view, meant prophetic ideals interpreted via socialist ideologies of equality. Now notice, socialist ideologies, plural. There's different types of socialist ideologies, and there were many arguments amongst them which particular socialist ideology or mix of socialist ideologies to adapt. But in general, all of them were an alternative to class society as represented by capitalism, and an alternative, that's in the general world, and an alternative in terms of the Jewish world to traditional power elite within the Jewish community of the wealthy and the rabbis. That was the power elite. Now, I want to say, by the way, the power elite in the Jewish community was not necessarily always, they weren't always, what should we say, quotation marks, bad. It's certainly not democratic. Very often they were extremely responsible people who took upon themselves those tasks. But in general, these young people objected to that as the matrix of Jewish society and felt that there had to be a more egalitarian society within a Zionist framework. Brackets. In general, the Zionist framework, even the people, not these people, but not these pioneers, the Chalutzim, in general, the Zionist movement pioneered within Judaism many democratic ideas. For example, women's suffrage was introduced in 1902. In 1902, not in the United States, not in Britain, did women have the right to vote. In America, I think it was only after the First World War. In a place like France, it wasn't until 1944. In a place like Switzerland, it wasn't until 1971. So, in other words, the Zionist movement in that sense was an enlightened movement from the word go. Otherwise, they wouldn't have been able to work with socialist pioneers. The precipitating events in the surrounding society between 1904 and 1924, which set the Zionist movement on its path, were the persecution of Jews, pogroms, which caused the first wave of pioneers in the 1880s, but not yet those who would form the kibbutzim. And they had a choice. Where do they go? Do they go to America, which at that time was open to immigration? And indeed, some of you, possibly your great-grandparents, or I don't know how many of you are involved in your family histories, would have come during those 30 years between 1880 and let's say 1920, 40 years, would have come that, you know, the Golden State, the Golden Medina, they would have gone to America. That's a vast majority. A very small minority would have come here. Another precipitating factor was the failed Russian Revolution of 1905, without going into the history. In other words, this led people to say, our future cannot be in Russia. We have to make another choice, which again might be America, or if they felt committed to the idea of Jewish renewal, then it might be what was then Palestine. However, there were other reactions. For example, there were those who said, we believe in the idea of socialism, but it has to be all over the world. We shouldn't have our own separate state. And they were the ones who were opposed to the socialist Zionisms. Again, the majority, the people who were Zionist and socialist, in that framework were a small minority. So we have a minority. Number one, they're a minority because most went to America. And number two, ideologically, if already they didn't go to America, they didn't believe that it was practical to go to what was then Palestine, a backwater of the Turkish Empire. Well, the two further stimuli were the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, which made it very difficult for any kind of Jewish national existence, even within a framework that a Jewish Socialist Party was prepared to be part of, let's say, the Soviet Union. And in addition, there was a wave, not generally known, that before Hitler came to power, some 20 years later, there was a wave of anti-Semitism in Eastern Europe, which propelled a mass exodus.
Two questions, if possible. First one, because of social revolution in Russia, and a lot of Jews was involved in this revolution too. So the idea of socialism, was born in Jewish environment, or Jews just take it from where? And
First of all, the original socialists did not see themselves as Jews. Marx may have been born a Jew, but he didn't see himself as a Jew. Yeah? But there were Jews at that time, let's say at the time of Marx. One very well-known one is called Moses Hess. And Hess really saw himself as a Jew and a socialist, but he rejected Marx in the end because Marx did not want to identify with his Jewish heritage and felt that the Jews were the center of capitalism, etc., etc. This is really going beyond the framework of this discussion. But, it is quite true, just like I said, that the Jewish diaspora socialism was also divided into streams. There were those who went into the Bund, there were those who went into the more extreme socialist forms which were not Jewish. For example, if I say a good Jewish name like Lev Davidovich Bronstein, don't you be quiet. Now, who is Lev Davidovich Bronstein?
Может, ты скажешь.
Leon Trotsky.
Trotsky.
Julius Osipovich Zetterbaum.
Это даже я не знаю.
Martov, a leader of the Mensheviks. There were the Bolsheviks and there were the Mensheviks. And the Mensheviks were somewhat more democratically oriented, but the Mensheviks they lost out to the Bolsheviks without going into the whole story. But yes, there were prominent people, but they didn't identify, except in his very last days before he got assassinated by Stalin. Leon Trotsky had a bit of a change of heart. But that is beyond our story here today. And so so we saw here what were the events that were shaping the head and the decisions of those young people who decided to eventually form kibbutzim. Now, on the other hand, the Zionist movement came along and wanted to recruit settlers, and they found these groups ready to do the work. But it was a tremendous argument, because the Zionist movement wasn't 19, 20, 21-year-old young people from Russia. No, the people who were giving the money, which wasn't very much, they were middle-class people, established capitalists from Germany, from America. And in those days, in 1917, 18, 19, 19, 20, when the whole middle-class world of Western Europe and America was looking at the Bolshevik Revolution, they couldn't differentiate between different kind of socialisms. They could say these young Jewish revolutionaries, for them, were just as dangerous and problematic as the leaders of the Bolshevik Revolution. They weren't into the niceties of the differences. So, Dr. Arthur Rupin, he was the marriage broker, like I said, and he wrote this in 1924. He said, no other problem in our settlement program has generated so many discussions as the problem of the kibbutzah, meaning the original kibbutzim. Those who praise it and those who decry it do so with equal passion, because you have a conservative Jewish middle class which fears young Jewish socialist revolutionaries. And the very small amount of money we have, we're going to give them?
Where it was happening? Like it was Europe, Germany, or it was already in Israel?
The Zionist movement was happening in Germany, it was happening in America, it was happening in Central Europe.
So
but the young people were coming mainly from the Russian and the Polish, especially the Russian environment.
I mean the discussion, like in the quotation.
In the Zionist congresses, in the institutions of the Zionist movement. These were the discussions.
Where?
Rupin was a civil servant. Who was paying Rupin's salary? The Zionist movement, which was gathering money from all the Jewish people. But all the Jewish people meant many of the people who were more wealthy and established, also from the poorer ones, but maybe in numbers, more poor Jews gave money. But in terms of amount of money, it came from the better-to-do Jews. Rupin's reasons. What were the reasons why he could convince suspicious people to give money to the kibbutz idea? Because he didn't have money to start for, let's say, a group like this, each and every one of you, a farmstead, a home separately. You don't have enough money for that. So it'd be better to have one large home farmstead, put all of you into it, buy one set of equipment. It also had the advantage that you'd pool talents of various people for all around agricultural and managerial ability. And there was another problem. If you want individual homesteads, you have to have a demographic balance between men and women. But there wasn't. There were mostly men, and not enough women to go around. And so that was an additional reason not to set up individual homesteads based on a family structure.
Because women hasn't been immigrated from the countries.
Yeah, because women didn't have the freedom to the same extent that men did. Some did, but not many not. But the two big reasons that Rupin had to convince the people was that he didn't have enough money for all these individual, and he had also another major problem, and that is how to make sure that the people would stick it out. Because he didn't have a social work department at the beginning of the 20th century, and he didn't have psychometric tests, Rorschach or anything else. What was he going to do? If the people failed, he'd be responsible for sending them back to Europe, additional expenses. He had to find a cheap, effective system of how to select the people. And the cheap and effective system was self-selection. Because he understood, he was a smart man, he understood, that they didn't want to fail, and if they decided who would be part of the group, they would be the best judges of who would not fail. And then, of course, there was an intangible asset, which Rupin understood, but the others didn't, that there was the enthusiasm and the commitment, the total commitment of these young people. So what were the stages in this marriage of convenience? Very quickly, from the point of view of the World Zionist Organization, the WZO, a middle-class diaspora, that they were interested in an agricultural infrastructure, because people knew that most of the country was not going to be agricultural. It was going to be urban. Now, maybe not to the extent we have today, but already in the beginning of the 20th century, especially those who knew what was happening in America, realized that agriculture was becoming mechanized and that fewer and fewer people were needed for it. But you had to have an agricultural infrastructure for the urban population. In addition to which, these kibbutzim at that time were a framework for absorbing immigrants. In other words, the collective group then became collectively responsible for a certain number of immigrants, solved another problem for the World Zionist Organization. As for the pioneers, yes, this was their chance to create in micro their vision of Jewish renewal, Hebrew land, Hebrew labor, Hebrew language, and social justice, which they would want to see in the future Jewish state. So, we have the agriculture on the left side here. We have the agricultural infrastructure, good also for absorption, especially for youth. At a later stage, the format of the kibbutz, when in the mid-1930s, people began to talk about dividing up Palestine between the Jews and the Arabs, then in terms of staking out claims and settling in areas which were almost uninhabitable, the kibbutz form of mutual responsibility was the most practical form. So, although they didn't agree with the ideology, they could agree with the practical aspect of it. So the kibbutzim, in effect, also became, in the mid-1930s, a kind of an elite. Within the Zionist movement itself, in the mid-1930s, the more socialist elements took over from the more conservative middle-class elements before. And so you really had a coming together of the kibbutzim as an elite of the Jewish settlement. Now, everything I'm telling you here is a history which is totally different from any other communal movement of the 19th or the 20th century. It's totally different. This was an integral part of a national movement which, even though it was through a marriage of convenience and not of love, received support from people who really didn't believe in those communal ideas. They received the support because they were serving a purpose of creating a state for the Jews. And of course, on that point, the pioneers agreed totally with the Zionist movement. They were also part of the Zionist movement. So the kibbutzim, they became also a nucleus of military underground activity within the consensus of what should be such underground activity, because there were underground movements here which were outside of the consensus, which were engaged in more violent activity without going into details. But during this period also, the kibbutzim saw themselves as being sure they have their internal ideology, but really their task was a practical task of helping to establish the state. Now, after the establishment of the state, for the first generation, there was a kind of a situation where all of a sudden, theoretically, the kibbutzim were not really necessary anymore. But on the other hand, the government of the country was a socialist government, basically. A socialist, it was a welfare government. It was a social democratic government, which many of the people were, however, members of kibbutzim. So there was a kind of a togetherness between the government and the kibbutzim, even though the kibbutzim were not that necessary anymore. And the kibbutz leadership was active in all areas: political, military, economic, and internally the kibbutzim were able to consolidate themselves economically, but two major problems emerged. One, on the side of the point of view of the government, the kibbutzim, which before the war were able to absorb immigrants, because the immigrants came from a cultural world which was somewhat similar to their cultural world. They came from the West, let's say. After the establishment of the state, you have mass immigration of two kinds of people. Number one, survivors of the Holocaust, but in many cases who were broken people, who had no particular attachment to the Zionist ideas. They simply, this is where they could go. A minority of them were also Zionists, but not all of them. But number two, and this determined more, to this day determined more, that the people who came from the countries of North Africa and the Near East, Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, Libya, Egypt, Lebanon, Syria, especially Iraq, Yemen, Persia, Iran. These people came from another world entirely. In no way, shape, or form could they relate to socialist